Um, okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the third talk of the 2023-2024 OCHS Virtual Winter Speaker Series. My name's Ben Valter, and I'm the Director of Education at the Ontario County Historical Society in Canandaigua, New York. Before I turn things over to our wonderful presenter, I have just a couple of quick announcements. So first, this entire speaker series highlights various topics related to recreation to coincide with our current exhibit, Let's Go Have Fun, which is all about recreation in Ontario County from 1900 to 1965. So if you have not already visited the exhibit, it will be closing in late April 2024 to make way for our next annual exhibit in May. So if you're in the Canandaigua area and you haven't come check it out, I would encourage you to do so. Information about the Historical Society can be found on our website, and you should be able to find the link to our website in the description of this talk. Also, this is the next to last talk, so if you haven't already looked into possibly joining us for the last talk next month, I would obviously encourage you to do so. And you can find out information about that on our website as well. And of course, thank you for tuning in this evening. If you have any questions or comments during the talk, type them into the live chat right here on YouTube, and I will pass them on to our speaker during the Q&A period at the end. Speaking of, allow me to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Victoria Wolcott is a professor of history at the University of Buffalo and director of the Gender Institute, also at UB. Dr. Wolcott's areas of expertise include 20th century American history, African American history, gender and sexuality, social and cultural history, and urban history. She's published a bunch of articles and books on these various topics, including the book that tonight's talk is connected to, Race, Riots, and Roller Coasters. So if you enjoy tonight's talk, I have put a link in the description here to the publisher page about race, riots, and roller coasters specifically, as well as a link to Dr. Wolcott's UB page where you can find links and information to several of her other publications. But without further ado, I will turn things over. So, Dr. Wolcott, please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here and talking to people about this. And Benjamin's going to be in charge of sharing my PowerPoint. So thank you for that. There was a little bit of a hiccup with my Zoom about sharing. So this is all going to work out. I'm so excited to talk to you about recreation. I wrote this book, Race, Riots, and Roller Coasters, a few years ago. And I actually kind of want to start with the end of the book in some ways, which is about the question of nostalgia. I feel like there has been in recent years a lot of kind of, documentary films, websites, other kinds of publications about the nostalgia for old wooden roller coasters, old swimming pools, swinging dance halls, etc., that have been celebrated about the sort of golden age of recreation. But rarely do these public depictions of the past highlight the racial exclusion on which recreation was premised. And that's going to be the topic of my talk today. And unfortunately, a lot of this is around the question of violence and the ways in which these spaces were essentially safeguarded and policed by ordinary people in order to keep them basically as white only kinds of spaces. And I should say also, this particular book project is really a place-based methodology. That is, from the inception, I really was looking at specific amusement parks, roller skating rinks, other places of recreation, and kind of thinking about the ways in which they were, you know, uh, negotiated, how people inhabited them, and how they were policed in many ways. You can do the next slide, Ben, that would be great. And one of the things I want to talk about just at the outset is why this history of recreation in relationship to race and racial segregation has been really a kind of hidden history, a history that's not really been talked about. And again, that's related to nostalgia, certainly. Play is associated with childhood, it's associated with families. Children are protected in our culture. They're clearly, innocent. And their experience of going to places like swimming pools, roller skating rinks, amusement parks is also, in a sense, protected, right? This particular image that you're looking at right now is from Baltimore, Maryland in the early 1950s. You can see these two African American girls looking in on a segregated public swimming pool, who are trying to get access to this kind of space. Um, Also, the other reason I think that much of this history has been neglected or hidden is that conflict in sites of recreation were really due to one particular group of children, which was the teenager. So Black and white teens fought over these spaces, and often, therefore, this kind of conflict was dismissed as a form of juvenile delinquency, particularly in the 1950s, right? So this is juvenile delinquency. It's not about actual struggles over segregation. When I talk about the Crystal Beach riot in a little bit, you'll really see a good example of this. So there's sort of two sides of the coin in terms of the significance of play and recreation as it's associated with children. For many white families, defending play spaces from potential violence, incursions from those from the outside, particularly African Americans, was about safety for them. It was about issues around cleanliness, which is related to racial stereotypes, and trying to defend their families from the incursion from outsiders. But for African Americans, having access to recreation marks citizenship and dignity. These kinds of pools, like the one that you see here, were pools that were, paid for by tax dollars that African Americans actually paid, but they did not have actual access to these kinds of forms of recreation. And of course, the disappointment about the ability of African American parents to allow children to have access to these places was incredibly deeply painful. So exclusion from recreational spaces could have even more weight than exclusion from other spaces for African American families. So just to give you a little bit of sense of this, there's a lot of contrasting memories you can get from, thinking about these recreational spaces from Blacks and from whites. And I'm just going to give you a quote that actually opens up my book from Martin Luther King Jr., from Letter from Birmingham Jail from 1963, when he says, "When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait." So King is talking here about that experience as a Black father, where he has to try to explain to his children why they cannot go to Funtown. A couple other quotes here. This is Eleanor Jordan. She is talking about Louisville, Kentucky, and Fontaine Ferry Park during the 1950s. And she says, "Whenever we pass that amusement park, you see the lights, the big Ferris wheel that had green lights on it. And we would always ask the same question, can we go? And my mother and father would almost simultaneously say, no, you can't go." We'd kind of sit there. And then as we passed it, we'd say, well, why can't we go? And that's when there was just this deafening silence in the car. And my mother her eyes would always fill up with tears. And my father would just kind of look away. And we knew something was wrong. And another quote about Fontaine Ferry Park in Louisville from an African American man recalling his childhood. And he says, "I didn't realize I was Black and Black was different until I stood outside Fontaine Ferry one day. We didn't understand why we couldn't go in there. When you are a child and you see other children having fun, You can't understand why you can't do it too. It was very sad feeling. Even after they let us go in, nobody really felt welcome. And that piece of that quote about even after they let us go in, we didn't feel welcome is a really important part of this story. So these memories really call into question a kind of romanticized, nostalgic idea of the golden age of amusements, but they also suggest the importance of recreation and play in really everybody's lives. That this is a really, really important space, part of childhood, part of pleasure, and part of really citizenship as well. So I want to turn now to something that I don't really talk about at length in the book, but I think is important as a historian, which is the role of the World's Fairs and kind of the emergence of recreation. And Ben, if you could just do the next slide, that would be great. Thank you so much. And this is also going to have a Western New York connection in terms of the Pan American Exposition. Before I get to that, though, I want to just mention the Chicago's World Fair. This is in 1893, also known as the Columbian Exposition. And this was a celebration of the 400th year of Columbus's arrival in North America. And really, World's Fairs in the 19th century and then into the first half, at least, of the 20th century really became a space where intellectuals, urban planners, and others could kind of communicate ideas about where society was going, about ideology, etc., to the broad public. And so the Chicago World's Fair came to symbolize in many ways this sort of idea of what an ideal city would look like in the 20th century, in the turn of the century. You see here the one image of what we call the white city. Chicago in the 1890s was not a white city. It was a city covered with soot, covered with pollution. Frederick Law Olmsted, actually, of course, who also helped to plan the city of Buffalo, planned the Columbian Exposition in 1893 as this sort of idealized, perfect city. You can see the neoclassical architecture, the white buildings that were demonstrated here. And this was an incredibly popular moment for this kind of display. You can see the crowds here. The fair opened in May of 1893, and historians estimate that 27 million people visited the Chicago World's Fair. So it's incredibly popular. It's a way to kind of communicate all sorts of ideas about American society. And actually, next slide. Thanks, Ben. And for the conversation about recreation, I think the thing that's really important about the Chicago World's Fair is essentially is the first time that we have a kind of nascent idea of the amusement park, right? So you have a midway at the Chicago World's Fair. No other World's Fair had ever had a midway before at this point. And you have, on the one hand, these kind of mechanized rides. So you have a Ferris wheel here. This is the largest single piece of forged steel ever. The Ferris wheel was designed by George Ferris. He was an engineer from Pennsylvania. It was 264 feet tall. It had 36 of these giant wood veneered cars, which included 60 people each, right? So this is the kind of advent of the mechanized ride for the very, very first time at the Columbian Exposition. The Ferris wheel and other mechanized rides get transported actually to Coney Island when those particular rides open up in 1904. So that idea of the mechanized ride is really new in the 1890s. And if you think about this, the streetcar, the electric streetcar was also developed during the same period. And so people are now like using this new technology to think about recreation in new ways. They take the streetcar, they make it smaller, and they put it on a roller coaster, essentially, around the turn of the century. So that kind of advent of the amusement park, our kind of modern idea of the amusement park, is really important with the Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair. On a more problematic note, you also have on the Midway these displays of racial hierarchy and basically social Darwinism. There was a exhibit called All in Their Places in the Chicago World's Fair, which displayed a progression essentially of cultures, so that people would basically walk down this sort of avenue and they would see the evolution of civilization, where you would have less civilized people going up towards more civilized people in this social Darwinistic, scientific, racist kind of ideal. On the less civilized side, you would have African peoples, indigenous peoples, people from Asia as well, up to Southern and Eastern Europeans, and then Northern Europeans, along this, this kind of continuum, right? When it came to the people who were considered to be less civilized, in terms of the designers of the Midway, they would actually display human people, including here you see the Dahomey village Africans. There were also indigenous people who were displayed in this exhibit, all in their places in the Chicago World's Fair. But when you got up to the sort of European people, the people who are considered more civilized by the organizers of the Midway, they would not have people displayed, they would have artifacts. They would have products from their country, Denmark, Germany, etc., and not actual people. So this was a way in which these kind of communication about race, about social Darwinism, was communicated to the masses in this kind of public space. And this all got kind of transported into amusement parks in the early 20th century, which is really, really important note to kind of think about the way recreation was related to race, right? So as at the same time that you have these stark racial divisions, segregation, Jim Crow laws, ideas of social Darwinism, you also have the advent of commercial recreation like roller skating rinks, like amusement parks at the same time. And so that's one of the reasons why those spaces are really, really heavily segregated. Before I leave the Chicago World's Fair, I just need to say that there was resistance to this. Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells were, two prominent activists and intellectuals, African American intellectuals and activists, who penned a pamphlet protesting the racial stereotypes that were depicted at the fair and calling for a boycott. So there was always resistance from African Americans from the very, very beginning. Next slide, please. Thanks. So let's get to Western New York. Pan American Exposition, 1901. Not as successful as the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Partly the weather apparently was bad that summer in Buffalo. But really important in sort of thinking about Western New York history and this broader history in terms of this ideas about racial hierarchy, and also its relationship to imperialism at the turn of the century. The Spanish-American War had wound up in 1898 with the acquisition of the annexing of various colonies, including Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And partly what this exposition was doing is kind of celebrating imperialism and also the sort of idea of the Americas more generally. So it was trying to sort of teach, think about this idea that Latin Americans should look to their northern neighbors and Caribbeans for guidance. And this is a quote from some of the propaganda around the exposition, that their gigantic northern neighbor is a comrade and friend and not a potential tyrant or oppressor. And the inhabitant of the United States must learn that his nation's size and strength and wealth do not make unnecessary or unworthy the serious efforts of Latin or Teutonic communities to the south of us to build American institutions of their own. Next slide. So some of you might be familiar with the Pan Am Exposition. It was also a celebration of electricity through Niagara Falls, at this important moment at the turn of the century. And also similarly to the Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair was very much about the kind of height of civilization in these various displays that you see in the World's Fair. So there was also a midway at the Pan American Exposition. So the first midway was the Chicago World's Fair, and this is the second one. Next slide. Thanks so much. And again, the midway is really a kind of means to talk about the ideology and the kind of racial hierarchies of the moment. And particularly striking here is the Philippine Village at the Pan American Exposition. There was an ongoing war happening in the Philippines during this period. So in 1901, after America annexed the Philippines, taking away from the Spanish Empire, there is an ongoing war there that's incredibly violent, incredibly brutal. And so you have this Filipino village at the Pan American Exposition with Filipino people who are villagers who are living in this little village, and they're actually being guarded by American soldiers. So it's a kind of performative display essentially of imperialism in this period. It's an 11-acre enclosure with a detachment of United States soldiers on parade. There's 100 native Filipino who are actually living in this village throughout the entire time of the World's Fair. Next slide. You also have other sort of disturbing exhibitions during the Pan American Exposition, the Darkest Africa exhibit in particular. There's 98 African peoples along with various animals who are being displayed in this exhibit, in the Darkest Africa exhibit. Again, partly about imperialism at the turn of the last century. And again, this is all part of like what recreation is being considered. There's also an old plantation exhibit where there's 50 African Americans who are hired to represent enslaved peoples. And you could actually go and you could pick cotton at the old plantation exhibit and try to, sort of engage in that sort of lost cause narrative, basically erasing the violence and the subjugation that is slavery. So that's all happening in Buffalo, New York in 1901. Next slide, please. And again, there's resistance to this, right? So there's a Negro exhibit. This is organized by W.E.B. Du Bois. He's also working with local activists, including Mary Talbert, who's a very, very prominent African-American woman in the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in Buffalo, New York, the Phyllis Wheatley Club, very important club in Buffalo, New York as well. And so they are counteracting some of these more racist exhibits by having this Negro exhibit to display all the advances of Black society since emancipation. So that sense of resistance there, I think, is really key when you're thinking about some of the issues involved with these World's Fairs. But you can see the birth of the amusement park, the birth of kind of 20th century recreation is really based on these World's Fairs and also some of the racial hierarchies that are displayed there. Next slide. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to move forward now more into sort of the book topic to go into the 20th century. And so one of the things that I argue in my book is that you have these race riots really throughout the 20th century, and so many of them are related to spaces of recreation. And I think this is really significant. I often call them recreation, or in the book, I call them recreation riots, right? That are involved in these clashes around these spaces of recreation. And many of these spaces are highly contested, particularly spaces around swimming pools and also beaches, because of white racial stereotypes that African Americans are not clean, that African Americans are somehow, embody sort of senses of disorder. So one of the most famous riots of the early 20th century, the Chicago riot of 1919, can be classified as one of these recreation riots. So just to give you a sense of what happened here, the city of Chicago was a highly segregated city in this period of the Great Migration of African Americans to the north. So there's a huge influx of Black migrants into the city in the late teens and into the 1920s. Lots of anxiety around that. All the beaches in Chicago were highly segregated in this period. So what happens in 1919 is that there was a young boy, along with a couple other young African American boys, who were swimming on the Black beach, and they swam out and they grabbed onto a log, basically, this one boy in particular, and that log floated over to the area where the white beach was. And a group of white people threw rocks at him and drowned him, right? So this is what started the riot, that this young boy had inadvertently moved over to a segregated beach, was killed by a white, white crowd at that beach. Then all sorts of rumors flow out from this about retaliation, etc. And it turns into this massive race riot in 1919. 15 whites were killed, 23 African Americans were killed during this riot. So this is a really, really kind of important moment in thinking about the ways in which in the North, so we're not talking about the South here, we're talking about a segregated North, is trying to struggle around issues around recreation and issues around segregation. And here you start to see this sort of discourse around violence as being for many judges, mayors in the North, that segregation is essentially for them violence prevention. They see what happens in Chicago in 1919, and there's many other cases. And for them, the lesson is let's make things more segregated to keep the racial peace. And that's a really, really important kind of theme that goes through the 20th century. Essentially, segregation is a form of violence prevention. Have the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so moving ahead a little bit, thinking about the mid 20th century, there is a shift in the discourse around race. You start to hear, more conversations about what historians talk about as racial liberalism, which is where the federal government and some liberal white communities, the YMCA, the YWCA, for example, are starting to sort of soften their discourse around racial segregation and around the kind of question of race. So this is under the Truman administration. Under Truman, he releases this report, Segregation in Washington, a report of the National Committee on Segregation, the nation's capital. And you can see here that there is in the 1940s, even from the federal government, a sense that segregation is a serious issue and an issue that's causing a lot of racial strife in the country. This is also on the heels of World War II, where you have a segregated military, which led to a lot of racial conflict during the war years. So Truman actually comes out as a kind of racial liberal and starts to kind of soften the rhetoric from the Democratic Party in particular around racial segregation. At the same time, you start to have the emergence of pretty more radical civil rights organizations. The most important one is the Congress of Racial Equality from 1942. And from the very beginning, these more radical civil rights organizations are really stressing recreational sites. So Congress of Racial Equality, the very, very first attack on segregation is on a roller skating rink in the 1940s in the city of Chicago. And they go on to attack segregation in swimming pools, roller skating rink, and amusement parks really throughout the country, but particularly the Midwest and the North in the 1940s and 1950s. So you're starting to get a more wholesale attack on segregation and recreational facilities. Next slide. So this is a good example of what's happening in the 1940s. So you have this sort of racial liberalism rhetoric, and then you have these attacks by these more radical civil rights organizations like CORE. And you have, of course, you can see here is a white backlash. So this is St. Louis. This is a fairgrounds park in St. Louis in the summer of 1949, where there was a major, so what happens is the mayor decides to desegregate the swimming pool in this major park in St. Louis. And you can see the response. There's a massive, basically white-led riots trying to stop that segregation, which is successful. The mayor closes down the park, closes down the swimming pool for several years after this particular piece of violence, right? So this is a really, really common pattern. And so basically, this again shows you the ways in which white violence is what polices segregation, and the ways in which the reaction from mayors, from federal officials is, in order to keep the peace, we need to keep these facilities segregated in order to prevent this kind of violence. Next slide. So this is the story that kind of got me down this rabbit hole of recreation. This is the first case that I actually investigated when I was thinking about the question of segregation and recreation, which is the 1956 Crystal Beach riot. And this is a race riot that happened at the Crystal Beach amusement park. So those of you who are from Western New York, maybe some of you have memories of Crystal Beach. It's been closed for a while. But there used to be these boats. The Canadiana is the most important one for in the case here, that would travel from Buffalo to Southern Ontario to the Crystal Beach amusement park. And this is true in a bunch of amusement parks. They had these kind of steamboats that would do these travels. So this is the summer of 1956. And what was going on here is that you had a big influx of African-American migrants in the 1950s to Buffalo, New York, trying to get jobs in industrial work, other kinds of, sort of booming economy in Buffalo during that period. And the Crystal Beach amusement park was not openly segregated. There was no sort of indication that African Americans could not actually go to the park. Longtime Black residents of Buffalo knew that it was dangerous to go to the park, that you might be abused, you might be subjected to racial epithets, and particularly on the beach, the Crystal Beach itself, the swimming beach, definitely was segregated, again, by kind of custom, by policing on the part of ordinary white people. So in this Memorial Day opening day in 1956, what happens is that there's a large number of African-American teenagers, and again, the teenager thing is really important here, who go to the park on the Canadiana on this boat. And when they arrive at the park, they get into all sorts of fights with Italian and other white ethnic groups who dislike the fact that they're there. So there's physical altercations. There's a Black family with some young children who are attacked as well. So on the trip back to Buffalo on the Canadiana, and there was a storm on that trip as well, so there's sort of drama there. There's fighting essentially on the boat between Black and white teenagers. And then this turns into this sort of major event. So nobody is killed during this riot. Nobody is seriously injured during this riot. But for many Americans, particularly in southern states, the violence that happened in 1956 in Buffalo becomes a kind of lesson in what happens when you have integration, right? So I'm just going to read you some headlines from Southern papers who had these headlines on the front page of their newspapers, right? So this is a relatively small event in some ways, but it's taken up by really the nation as a warning about what happens when you have integration. So the headlines are things like holiday outing turns into voyage of terror, Negro knifers turn outings to nightmare, flashing knives, sobs mark race riot on pleasure boat, savage race riot on boat being investigated by the FBI, which did happen. Negro rioters turn cruise into bedlam. So these are the front page kind of headlines around the country, but particularly in the South. So the Crystal Beach riot, although in terms of the scale of race riots is relatively mild, becomes a kind of warning for the nation. And so it's significant in that way. Also significant is the Crystal Beach company. They stopped the Canadiana and other steamboats from coming to the Crystal Beach amusement park. And this is going to be a tactic that we're going to see throughout the post-war period, where you used to be able to take this boat, not very much money, to get to the amusement park. Now you're going to have a private car to get to the amusement park, and the amusement parks do this deliberately to try to limit access to the park and also limit racial conflict. Next slide. And that brings us to Disneyland, of course. Disneyland opens in 1955, and Walt Disney, the consummate business person who's just always, has a sense of what's going to work to make money. He actually travels the country and he goes to a bunch of these amusement parks, these older amusement parks that are based on steamboats and streetcar lines that are beginning to, decline a bit in terms of their infrastructure and also beginning to experience some of this racial conflict. And he really takes this into account when he opens Disneyland. So Disneyland is away from public transportation. It's hard to get to. You have to have a private car or a helicopter or something like that to actually get to Disneyland. That's not the case anymore. It's outside of LA. But that was certainly the case in the 1950s. He also noticed where there was the most racial conflict, which was swimming pools, beaches, roller skating rinks, and dance halls, right? These are places where people are intimately connected to each other. There's more kind of physicality, and there's more kind of issues around racial exclusion. You don't want to have mixed race dancing or mixed race roller skating or, God forbid, swimming amongst the races. So Disney excludes all of those venues from Disneyland, which is a very clever kind of business strategy in many ways. He also does this new thing where he imposes a high gate fee. So amusement parks in the past, the streetcar parks, you would pay only for the rides that you went on. So, working class people could actually get access to these parks, go into the gates, enjoy the park, enjoy the various amusements, etc., and they would pay for the rides if they wanted to go on the rides. Disneyland had a gate fee, very high gate fee, so that excludes working class people and offers a sort of gatekeeping essentially for people who are going to actually access the park. And this is a lesson that Disney develops in the mid 1950s that's basically going to be embraced by all amusement parks moving forward. Next slide. So just kind of moving ahead chronologically, I talked about the 1940s as being the sort of moment when you have major civil rights organizations like CORE who are starting to challenge racial segregation in places of amusement. That's going to be heightened by the time, of course, you get to the early 1960s, where you have these major protests and amusement parks in the sort of middle states and into the north as well. Glen Echo is a great example of this in 1960. So this is an amusement park that's just outside of DC, and DC had a whole long history and legacy of struggle against racial segregation dating back to the 1940s, particularly at Howard University. So in 1960, there's a group of Black activists, including Lawrence Henry, you see here on the Ferris wheel, or not the Ferris wheel, the merry-go-round rather. who had worked with Stokely Carmichael and other activists at Howard University to form the Nonviolent Action Group. And they targeted the Glen Echo Park, which was fully segregated in the summer of 1960 with daily pickets and direct action. And you can see this interaction here between the police officer and Lawrence Henry, who is challenging racial segregation at this park. And this is happening not just at Glen Echo, but really throughout the country. There's a number of different parks in this period. So because of the strength of this protest, the park does reopen in 1961 on a non-segregated basis. Actually, next slide, I think I have another slide about you can see here a little bit about the counter-protest as well, just to give you a little bit of sense of the resistance. So on the one hand, you have the civil rights protesters here who are, talking about discrimination, but the American Nazi Party and other white supremacist groups are out in full force in Glen Echo and elsewhere throughout the country, really, really focusing on the resistance to this racial integration. So the park reopens in 1961. However, they follow the kind of Disney model. They have a newly built gate for what they call more effective control of persons entering and leaving the park. And African Americans who were now finally able to go to Glen Echo were really cautious. They would only go in organized groups. They definitely did not go into the swimming pool. They knew they would be beat up if they actually did that. And so there was, sort of integration of the park, but it was definitely on a kind of moderate level. However, 5 years after this desegregation effort, you do have a major recreation riot that happens in Glen Echo Park. And in this case, to the next slide. Okay, I don't actually have a slide about this recreation riot. Let me just quickly describe it to you. So what happens 5 years after desegregation is you have large numbers of Washington, D.C. youth, teenagers who are taking public buses to go to Glen Echo Park, which you could do in this period. They get there and they buy ride tickets and they buy entrance tickets, etc. And there is a kind of reaction on the part of the park managers where they feel like there's so many Black people in the park, it's out of control. And they cut off the public buses going back. So all these young people are stranded at the park and they have to actually physically walk back to Washington, D.C. from the park. And this is essentially described as a riot. And the park closes very soon after that. And that's not a unique situation. Many of these amusement parks that were in more urban areas closed down in the early 1970s, partly in reaction to this process of integration and the racial violence that follows with integration. So I want to just talk a little bit about sort of the impact of this more broadly, and some of the issues around the nostalgia of the park, and then kind of open it up for conversation. So again, I mentioned many of these parks closed. Glen Echo closes in 1966. Coney Island in Cincinnati, same year. Fontaine Ferry, which I have those quotes from, 1969. Olympic Park in 1965, that's outside of Newark. And that's all in reaction to the kind of racial conflict that happens after desegregation. So what are the consequences of this? I mean, a lot of what happens in the 1970s and beyond is that public recreation in general, public swimming pools, which used to be very lavish and beautiful, closed down, right? Public recreation and other forms also becomes increasingly privatized. Many of these urban amusement parks that working class people could actually access through much of the 20th century, including lots of white working class folks, closed down. So you have instead theme parks that are hard to get to, they're more expensive, etc. So this is sort of part of a larger story about neoliberalism. And this is also true of places like roller skating rinks and bowling alleys, which are really important sites of recreation for African Americans and white working class folks. A lot of those places also closed down, and they continue to close down with real negative impact for urban communities. And there's also a kind of memory about these closures where many white people actually sort of blame African Americans for the disorder that created the cause for the close downs. What's often happening, particularly with urban amusement parks, places, Crystal Beach maybe, but also like Riverview Park in Chicago, is that the land is really valuable. So the private owners who own these amusement parks are seeing this disorder and they're using this as a justification to sell the land to private developers. So there's ways in which African Americans who are integrating these spaces become the scapegoats for the closing down of these spaces. I would also just say more generally, even after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and sort of the height of the civil rights movement, there's a kind of continued association of Black bodies, of African Americans in particular kinds of spaces as being associated with disorder or problematic potential conflict. So that way in which segregation was attached to violence prevention continues in some ways past the civil rights era. And then just finally to kind of conclude here, so we have a little bit of time for conversation, just to go back to the kind of question of nostalgia. There is a way in which the nostalgia of these recreational places really erases the legacy of Jim Crow segregation and its legacy. You can see here, this is from Seabreeze, from outside of Rochester, which actually was never segregated. But if you look at the photographs from previous decades, you can see that it's largely all white. And there's just a lot of nostalgia about the spaces as being places of great pleasure. I think I have one more slide, Ben, before I stop. Here, this is the Canadiana slide, memorabilia. As a Buffalonian, you cannot go anywhere without Crystal Beach nostalgia. And when I talk about the history of the 1956 riot, the ending of the Canadiana, there is really a kind of erasure of memory around that, about what the cause of why that particular boat stopped going to Crystal Beach. And I think that this is a really important thing to intervene in. So I'm going to end it there, but I would love to hear questions and comments that people might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Yes. Any questions you have in the chat? This way the stream works, you guys who are watching are a couple minutes behind us, but I do already have one question to start us out. But if anybody else has any more questions, please feel free to ask. But from the chat, the question is, did you find in your research any notable differences between riots and protests at like officially segregated recreation sites versus more like socially or de facto segregated sites?
Yeah, such an important question. And there's such a diverse range of how these places are segregated. So of course, there's actually not that many big amusement parks in the South. It's sort of interesting. So many amusement parks were kind of partially segregated. So like Euclid Beach Park, for example, where you would have the dance hall, the swimming pool, the roller skating rink would be segregated, but Blacks could go to other parts of the park, right?
Yeah.
So in those places, civil rights activists would just target the dance hall, the swimming pool. And then you have parks that were entirely segregated, where it's more, like outside the gates. But then, yeah, great question about a place like Crystal Beach, where it's much more confusing. There's no white only signs. This is it's Canada, it's Ontario. So there it's more about this sort of conflict among ordinary people. So there is really a range. And And if you only look at the kind of organized civil rights protest, I don't think you kind of get that range. I think a lot of what was going on, particularly in the North, was ordinary African Americans like trying to rent those roller skating, shoes at a park, being refused, maybe contacting the NAACP, filing a lawsuit, that kind of thing. So there is definitely a range, and definitely the parks where it was fully segregated were the ones where you would have a more kind of robust, like Glen Echo,
Yeah.
or yeah, that would be a more kind of what we would think of as a classic civil rights demonstration. So it's a bit mushier in other
Mm-hmm.
places, but I was really fascinated kind of looking at the research with how many ordinary Black families, often it was Black mothers who were trying to help their children. Like they'd be new migrants to a city like Cleveland or Cincinnati or Buffalo, and they would see something advertised to the public, and they would bring their kids and then be horrified when their kids were not allowed in, or maybe sometimes subject to violence. So yeah, that's a great question. So there's a big range, but for in the North, a lot of the policing of segregation was done by ordinary white toughs,
Yeah.
essentially,
Yeah.
who were
Right.
physically violent. Yeah.
Right. I guess on a related note, then, do you see any sort of differences in the contour of these riots and protests in like early 20th century versus say the 60s, right, when it's we're more firmly entrenched in the civil rights era specifically? Do they look different between those time periods, or are they still pretty similar regardless of the time period?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you really see that as soon in the 1890s, when you get these commercial recreation spaces created, there's already protest.
Yeah.
But not in the same way as you get in the 40s through the 60s. So it's more individual African Americans who are trying to get access to these spaces. There's a big roller skating craze in the 1890s that
Hmm.
people might not know about. It's like a big roller skating thing. And there was a bunch of lawsuits filed
Huh.
by Black people, like trying to get access to roller skating rinks because they're great. And they would sometimes be successful because there were the 1866 civil rights laws on the books in some of these states, including New York State. And they would sometimes be successful in the courts for themselves, but not as a class action kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So it's more individualized, I think, in that earlier period. By the time you get to the 40s with the Congress of Racial Equality, and the kind of stepping up of NAACP, it's more organized. It's more, they're using Gandhian nonviolent tactics
Yeah.
super early, like CORE's doing that in 42, 43 at roller skating rinks, swimming pools. So that's a very different kind of model of protest in many ways.
Right.
But they're protesting all along. There's always resistance, and particularly during the New Deal. The New Deal invested a huge amount in recreation and particularly swimming pools. So there are all these Black taxpayers who are spending, their taxes are going towards the segregated swimming pools, and there's definitely protest against that.
Yeah.
But it is more organized. It's more about nonviolence later. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. Um, you talked about this a little bit during the presentation, but do you have any sort of additional thoughts on any sort of ongoing effects that de facto segregation, such as like redlining and white flight and all those sorts of
Yeah.
things, have had on access to recreation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so recreation is always related to housing segregation, and
Yeah.
as you were suggesting, redlining, neighborhood pools, neighborhood parks. But the thing I've been finding really fascinating, this book came out, a few years ago, but since COVID, I've gotten many more calls from journalists, and other folks who are working on these issues. I think
Yeah.
that COVID in particular really helped to reveal how the lack of access to recreation creates more, crime, more, all sorts of societal problems.
Right.
Um, the lack of access to swimming pools, etc. So I think there's been a heightened interest in the lack of public recreation and how that impacts cities in particular. So here in Buffalo, we've had incidences of refugee children who've drowned. And this is
Mm,
something I didn't mention in the talk, but one of the horrible sort of effects of this kind of segregation is that Black and brown children don't get access to swimming instruction.
mm,
And so the rates of drowning are much higher. And also because they can't access pools in the earlier period, they are swimming in what we call natural waters, rivers, etc. You do not want to do that in Buffalo. We have a giant waterfall.
yeah.
And
Right.
so we've had these terrible incidences of it's June and it's really hot, but the swimming pools aren't open, and children are going into the river and
Yeah.
drowning. So there has been a heightened concern about that, which that's incredibly tragic, but I'm glad that people are paying attention. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I had just one question, myself. I was really interested by what you're talking about with sort of the public access to amusement parks, how they like stop doing like trams or
Yeah.
steamboats or that sort of thing, um, in order to cut down on accessibility and thus maintain this sort of de facto segregation. I thought that was really interesting. Do you see that as being connected to a decline in public transit in general, or more specifically with amusement parks? Because just for example, Canandaigua, and I don't actually remember when. I don't know what year they stopped it, but there used to be a trolley that went from Rochester to Canandaigua,
Oh yeah.
which is somebody who lives in the Rochester area and commutes to Canandaigua for work every day. I would love to have a public trolley I could ride instead of driving on 490. So anyway, is there a connection there, or do you see it more specifically with amusement parks and other public transit decline has other causes?
I mean, both. So I love to show the maps of the interurban transportation that was available, pre 1950s in Western New York
Yeah.
region. I mean, I would also love to take an interurban railroad to Niagara Falls easily,
Yeah.
and to Rochester. Oh my God, it was incredibly intricate, and there was so much of it, and it was all dismantled. So it all kind of it kind of comes together at the same time.
Mm.
So in terms of the amusement parks, it was a very pragmatic. I think the amusement park owners saw it as a very pragmatic solution.
Yeah.
And I should say partly so to the question of integration, but also working class white ethnics. So
Right.
there was a lot of Italian and Jewish and other white ethnic groups that were working class and going to these places and creating a certain amount of havoc. And so they wanted to. It was in some ways a class issue as well.
Yeah.
So it was all sort of happening at the same time. I mean, the Canadiana is such a beautiful boat. The idea that they would close it down in 1956, uh, that clearly was because of the riot. But it's also part of this larger history of the dismantling of public transportation entirely in that post-war period, which
Yeah.
I think this region is particularly tragic. Maybe it's tragic for everywhere, but maybe I just particularly lament it.
Yeah, I feel it's tragic for this area in particular
Yes.
too. So yeah, we're in agreement there at least, for sure. Um, well, I don't have any more questions. I don't see any more questions from the chat, but I do have a couple people, thanking you for the presentation. Really appreciated the presentation, and just saying that they felt like they learned a lot, and thanks
Okay.
for answering questions. So thank you so much for participating. Thank you everybody who tuned in to watch us live. Video playback of the talk is available to you anytime, so that using that same link you got in the email, and I will send everybody a thanks for, tuning in email tomorrow, where I'll resend you all that link, so you'll have ongoing access to this talk. Yeah, thank you all very much, and I will see you all next month for our last talk. And thank you again, Dr. Wolcott, so very much.
Thanks, everybody.